Most people, when life knocks them down, spend the majority of their energy asking the wrong question. They ask, why did this happen to me? Now, I understand the question. I've asked it myself. But here's what I've learned after decades of study, travel, and talking to people from every walk of life. That question will keep you on the floor longer than the blow that put you there. You see, the storm doesn't care about your question. The loss doesn't pause to explain itself. The disappointment, the failure, the rejection, none of it waits for you to figure out the reason before it moves on. Life just keeps moving. And the only real question worth asking is this one. Now that this has happened, what am I going to do about it? That is the beginning of resilience. I've met people who had every reason to quit. I've met people who lost businesses, lost relationships, lost their health for a season and came back. Not bitter, not broken, stronger, wiser, more capable than before the storm ever arrived. And I've met others who suffered far less, a small setback, a minor disappointment, and never recovered. They carried that thing around for the rest of their lives like a weight they couldn't set down. What made the difference? That is what we're going to talk about today. Now, let me say something before we go further, because I think most people misunderstand what resilience actually is. Resilience is not toughness. That's an important distinction. Tough means you don't feel it, and I'm not sure that's healthy or even honest. The person who says, nothing gets to me, is either not paying attention or they're not telling the truth. Resilience is different. Resilience means you times do, times feel it, and you move anyway. You grieve, and then you get back up. You acknowledge the difficulty, and then you go to work on what comes next. I used to think that strength meant never being rattled. Mr. Schoaf, my mentor, set me straight on that early on. He said, Jim, it's not about how many times life shakes you. It's about whether you lose your way while it's shaking you. That stayed with me. And here's why it matters so much. The quality of your life long term is not determined by the problems you avoid. It's determined by how you respond to the ones you can't avoid. Nobody gets a life without storms. Nobody. The rain falls on everybody. But here's what changed my thinking completely. Resilience isn't just a character trait some people are born with. It's a set of learnable practices, habits, and decisions that anyone can develop. I've watched ordinary people build extraordinary resilience, not because of talent, but because of choices they made consistently over time. 7 of those choices, that's what I want to give you today. Accept reality without surrendering to it. The first thing I learned about resilience, and this took me a while to appreciate, is that you have to look at the situation clearly, not through rose-colored lenses, not through catastrophe lenses either, just clearly. I was in my 20s, flat broke, embarrassed by where my life had ended up relative to where I thought it would be. And I made a choice I see a lot of people make. I decided the situation wasn't as bad as it was. I dressed it up, made excuses, told myself it would work itself out without any real effort from me. That is not resilience. That is avoidance wearing a mask. Real acceptance means you look at the problem squarely and say, yes, this is what happened. Yes, it is what it is. Now, what can I do with what I have? There's a kind of peace that comes with honest acceptance, not a defeated peace, a times working times peace, a peace that frees you to act. The Stoic philosophers talked about this centuries ago. And what the research in psychology tells us today lines up perfectly with what those old thinkers understood. People who practice what psychologists call times acceptance, times not resignation, but honest acknowledgement, recover from setbacks faster. They spend less energy fighting reality and more energy changing what can be changed. Now here's the practical takeaway. When something hard happens, sit with it for a moment. Don't immediately run to distraction. Don't immediately minimize it. Say to yourself, this is real, this happened, what is actually within my control right now? Write it down if you need to. That single act of honest assessment is the first step off the floor. Build your reserves before the storm. Here's something I noticed over the years. Resilient people aren't more resilient because of what they do times after times the storm. They're more resilient because of what they did times before times it. Think about that. A tree that's been nourished over decades, its roots go deep. Deep enough that when the wind comes, it bends, but it doesn't break. A tree that grew fast in favorable conditions with shallow roots, the first serious storm takes it down. People are the same way. There are 4 reserves I want to talk about, because if you build these consistently, they become your invisible armor when life gets difficult. The first is physical reserves: sleep, nutrition, exercise. I know that sounds elementary, but I've watched people crumble under moderate pressure simply because they were already exhausted before the pressure arrived. Your body is where your mind lives. Take care of it. The second is financial reserves. Now, I've talked about money for a long time, and I'll say this plainly. Financial instability amplifies every other problem. A job loss is hard. A job loss when you have no savings is a genuine crisis that affects your ability to think clearly, to choose wisely, to act from strength. Saving is not just about comfort, it's a resilience strategy. The third is relational reserves, strong relationships. Not 1,000 acquaintances, a handful of people who know you well and care about what happens to you. Studies on resilience point to this again and again. The single most consistent factor in bouncing back from adversity is the quality of your relationships. Not your education, not your income, your times, people. And the fourth is spiritual reserves. A belief system, a philosophy, something that gives difficulty meaning, because without meaning, suffering is just suffering. With meaning, suffering can become a teacher. Faith for many people is precisely this, a framework that says, this is hard, but it is not without purpose. I've leaned on mine more times than I can count. Build the reserves. Don't wait for the storm to wish you had. Control the story you tell yourself. I've studied human behavior for most of my adult life, and here's one of the things that fascinates me most. 2 people can go through nearly identical experiences and come out with completely different conclusions. One person loses a business and says, I'm not cut out for this. Another person loses a business and says, now I know things I didn't know before. I'll do better next time. Same event, completely different story. Psychologists call this times explanatory style. The story you tell yourself about why things happen, how permanent the situation is, and how far-reaching the problem is, that story shapes your entire response. Resilient people tend to tell stories that are specific and temporary. This particular thing went wrong at this particular time for these particular reasons. Not, everything always goes wrong for me. Now let me be careful here, because I'm not suggesting you manufacture false optimism. That's not what I mean. I mean you look at the evidence honestly and you tell an accurate story. Most bad situations are more specific and more temporary than the panicked mind initially believes. I remember a period in my life when I'd made some poor decisions financially and professionally. The temptation was to tell myself a sweeping story, you're a failure, Jim. But when I sat down and looked honestly, the actual story was, you made 3 specific choices that didn't work out, and you need to change your approach. That's a workable story. The first one is just a life sentence. Watch the story, because you're always telling one. The only question is whether it's helping you or hurting you. Act even when you don't feel ready. Here's something counterintuitive I've observed. People often wait for motivation to arrive before they take action. They wait until they feel times like getting up. They wait until they feel times like making the call, starting the work, rebuilding what was lost. Here's what I found. That's backwards. Action creates motivation, not the other way around. You don't feel your way into acting. You act times your way into feeling. I learned this in a very practical way years ago when I was trying to rebuild my confidence after a particularly difficult season. Everything in me wanted to withdraw, to stay quiet, to wait until I felt better before I stepped back into the arena. And Mr. Schoaf, God bless him, he told me something I never forgot. He said, Jim, you can't wait to feel strong before you act strong. You have to act strong and let the feeling follow. He was right. This shows up in the science too. Behavioral activation is what therapists call it. The act of doing something, even something small, creates a sense of agency. And agency is the opposite of helplessness. Helplessness is what keeps people stuck. Action, even imperfect action, is what moves them out. Here's the practical piece. After a setback, pick one thing, just one, something small and doable. Make the call, write the page, go for the walk, not because you've solved everything, but because the movement itself signals to your mind that you are still capable. That signal matters more than people realize. Learn, but don't linger. Now, this is a fine line, and I want to draw it carefully. There is enormous value in learning from difficulty. Some of the most important things I know about life, about people, about business, I didn't learn them in good times. I learned them when things went wrong. Adversity has a way of teaching lessons that success simply cannot teach. Failure strips away the non-essential and shows you what actually matters. But, and this is important, there's a difference between learning and dwelling. Learning says, what happened? What was my role in it? What can I take from this so it doesn't happen again, or so I'm better prepared if it does? Dwelling says, what happened? How could this happen to me? Why me? Why now? What does this mean about who I am and whether I deserve good things? One is productive, the other is a trap. I've noticed that resilient people tend to conduct what I'd call a personal after-action review quickly, honestly, thoroughly. They extract the lessons, and then they move forward. They don't build a residence in the failure. They visit it long enough to learn, and then they leave. The key is to have a structure for it. Ask 3 questions after any significant setback. What actually happened as objectively as I can describe it? What, if anything, could I have done differently? What is the one most important thing I can take into the future from this? Answer those 3 questions, write them down, and then set the event in its proper place in the past, where it belongs. Find the community of the strong. I've said this in many forms over many years, and I'll say it again because it remains one of the most overlooked truths in personal development. You cannot become more than the average of the people you spend the most time with. This is true in general. In the context of resilience, it becomes especially critical. When you're down and everyone gets down, at some point the people around you either pull you up or keep you down. Not necessarily through what they say directly, but through the environment they create, through their expectations of you, through whether they model recovery or model permanent victimhood. I've watched people who were struggling turn completely around, not because of a book they read or a seminar they attended, but because they found themselves in the company of someone who had been through worse and come out the other side with their dignity and their joy intact. That person becomes a living proof of concept, a demonstration that recovery is possible. If you want to be more resilient, spend time with resilient people. Find them. Seek them out deliberately. Study them. Ask them how they think, how they talk to themselves, what they do on their worst days. Don't just admire them from a distance. Get close enough to be influenced. And equally important, limit your time with people who are addicted to their own suffering. I say that with compassion, not judgment. But chronic complainers, people who've turned their wound into their identity, spending significant time with them will borrow their perspective, whether you intend to or not. Choose your company like your life depends on it, because in more ways than one, it does. Develop a long view of your own life. The last lesson is perhaps the most important, and it's the one most often missing in today's world. We've lost our patience. We want the storm to be over quickly. We want the recovery to be fast. We want the wound to heal on our schedule. And when it doesn't, we interpret that as evidence that something is permanently wrong. Here's what I've found instead. The most important chapters of a person's life often look like the worst chapters while they're being lived. The setback that became the setup. The loss that redirected. The failure that taught the lesson no success could have taught. You need time to see what things actually mean, and that requires a long view. I've met people in their 50s and 60s who could look back at the hardest moment of their earlier lives and say, with full sincerity, that was the making of me, not in spite of the difficulty because of it. The difficulty added something. It built something. It removed something that needed removing. Now, you can't always see that while you're in it. I'm not going to tell you that you can. But what you times can times do, what the long view offers, is a kind of provisional trust. A willingness to say, I don't know yet what this is making me, but I am willing to trust that it is making me something. That perspective is not weakness. It is one of the most courageous stances a person can take. Viktor Frankl, a man who survived conditions most of us will never face, observed that those who survived the worst of circumstances had something in common. Not physical strength, not advantage. They had time's meaning, a reason to endure, a sense that their life had purpose, that the circumstance could threaten but not destroy. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to see the full picture. You just have to be willing to keep moving forward with the belief that the picture is larger than what you can currently see. That belief, cultivated consistently, is resilience in its deepest form. Let me leave you with something. I've been fortunate to speak with a great many people over the years. People from extraordinary circumstances, people from ordinary ones, people who had every material advantage, and people who had almost none. And the thing that strikes me most, the thing I come back to again and again is this. Life is equally hard for everyone, not in identical ways, not with identical hardships, but equally demanding of your best thinking, your best discipline, your best character. The storm comes for all of us. The question has never been whether it arrives. The question is what you've built, what you've practiced, who you've surrounded yourself with, and what you believe about the meaning of difficulty. If you wait for life to get easier before you decide to be stronger, you'll wait forever. But if you decide today, times, regardless of conditions, times to build the habits, to cultivate the philosophy, to take the actions that resilient people take, something changes, not immediately, not overnight, but over time. You become harder to knock down. And when you do get knocked down, you come back faster, wiser, carrying something you didn't have before. That is not a small thing. That might be the whole thing. Be patient with the process. Be consistent with the practices. Trust the long view. And when the next storm arrives, and it will, don't ask why it's raining. Ask what kind of person you're going to be while it does.